Don't forget that the Rule of Faith essay is due Thursday, and then the last set of summaries and the last set of the last primary source essay are due after Thanksgiving break. Have some time, but don't forget about that. Also, I have posted the study guide for the final. Part of the final will be just like what we've done in previous exams, and then there will be a comprehensive essay that is based on essentially one of three topics. One will be different conceptions about Jesus, so discussing all the different theologies and heresies related to Jesus. One's related to communion or the Eucharist, how that has developed and changed over time, and then also relationships between the church and society, how those have changed over time. So there'll be two essays on the final, and you'll have your choice as to which of those you would like to write. So there'll be a smaller essay like before, and then a larger essay as the comprehensive part. After you've had a chance to take a look at the study guide, please feel free to get in contact with me about any questions you might have. We're looking today at doctrines and doctrinal developments as we approach the Reformation period, which will end the course. We have 4 classes left, including today, and essentially we're going to use that last class to review some things, tie some things together. So we basically have 3 classes that we're going to be examining what we've been looking at up to this point. When it comes to doctrine, a lot of what we're looking at is based on things that happened in the previous period we've talked about, and then some developments as we move to the Reformation. So some things point backwards to where we've been before, others point forward towards setting the stage for the Reformation. One aspect that points somewhat back and somewhat forward is the development of universities in Europe, specifically, of course, thinking about the development of theology in the universities. Education under the time period of Christianity has largely been, throughout the Middle Ages, in schools connected to cathedrals, which were the churches where the bishop traditionally resided, or in monasteries. They were usually connected somehow with churches, whether that was by actually being connected with the church or where monks and nuns were teaching classes. In the 11th century, however, a variety of developments took place which led toward the development of what we think of in the modern university. Essentially, one of the major things pushing this forward was the desire to have professional clergy. Clergy that could deal with a variety of issues. We're talking about a period where there was a lot of growth and urbanization in Europe, and so priests and bishops, it was believed, needed to be able to deal with those particular issues. So there was a desire among those in the West, both religiously and secularly, that priests and bishops would have education in things like the canon law of the church, that we'll talk about in a little bit, church administration, including accounting. And bishops especially were in charge of large pieces of land, had a lot of funds coming in and out of their dioceses and their churches. But it was also felt that priests and bishops should also have the ability to reason. They would be skilled in logic. They would be skilled in theological disputation, especially as they would have to deal with heresy. Eventually, though, this demand moved schooling from being connected with a cathedral or with a monastery from those local churches or to schools in major cities. The earliest of the modern universities appear to have developed in the late 1000s, but really beginning in 1200 and on, you see this blossoming of universities. So some of the earliest would be the University of Bologna in Italy, in 1088, Paris in 1150, Oxford in 1167, and others of those famed European universities. Now, originally, a lot of the university setting is not what we think of. The term university just had to do with a group of people gathered for study, and so it could take place anywhere, in people's houses, for example. But eventually, universities developed into a more campus type of setting, like what we think of it, where they would rent or eventually buy or build buildings specifically for teaching. As the universities developed, there were essentially three types, and they varied sometimes by region. For example, in the University of Bologna, a lot of the authority rested in the students. It was the students who were responsible for hiring and paying teachers, which meant that they had a lot of control over teachers, including, in some places, fining their teachers. Now, you might think that might be something useful, but teachers could be fined for being incompetent. And I can certainly see why you would want to do that. If you're paying a person, you want them to be incompetent in the subject they're teaching. If they lectured too long, students might find makes sense, but they might also be fined for missing lectures. That's the teachers missing the lectures, not the students. So if the teacher didn't show up, they could be fined by the students. Failing to get through the syllabus and covering all the material in the syllabus was another area where students might fine a teacher. So in some places, a lot of the authority rested in the students. In other places, the church was still responsible for paying the teachers. The University of Paris, for example, is a model of where the church in the church hierarchy are responsible for finding the teachers, paying the teachers to educate students. In England, however, places like Oxford and Cambridge, it was the crown, it was the state that was responsible for paying the teachers. And some of this would, of course, tie the teachers more toward the crown than it would necessarily towards the church. And we talked about how there is, even during this time, a little bit of a distance between England and Catholicism that will continue to grow until it breaks open in the Reformation period. Teachers were accorded a lot of respect during this time, at least the good and popular ones. Often they would move around from university to university based on what a university would be willing to pay them. And as they were attracted to these universities, they often attracted students as well, and the students would follow after the teacher. It wasn't the prestige of the institution. It wasn't any sort of connection, institutional loyalty that you see at this time. It was the importance of the particular teacher. So you started off in Paris and the teacher moved to England, then a lot of the students would follow the teachers to England. Students started as early as the age of 14 and could still be studying in their 30s depending on the program. For example, if they were studying canon law, it would not be unusual for you to find students in the 30s. Very few women attended universities in this time period. Essentially, they were forbidden from earning degrees. So those that did engage in education often didn't receive the credentials having completing it. Also, very rarely did women receive instruction in Latin, which was a language that education was done in. Students also had the protections that clergy had as well, since a lot of the students would have been engaged in theological pursuits or religious pursuits. Any sort of crime that a student was accused of, they would have to face an ecclesiastical court instead of a secular court. In addition, students were not allowed to be corporally punished, just like clergy wouldn't have been. But with these students being unsupervised, living far from home as they traveled to these cities to study, they got the reputation of being very immoral. And a lot of students would, instead of going to classes, would just wander the cities, get drunk, involved in all sorts of other types of difficulties. By the 1230s, however, you see these universities beginning to separate from the church. Pope Gregory IX, for example, released a papal document in 1231 that gave the University of Paris autonomy from the church, that it was a separate institution. And essentially what you have here is this developing of a guild of scholars to protect each other, to certify proficiency, to authorize credentials. That it's kind of separate and apart from the church. Especially when it came to theology, there were a couple of traditional tracks that students would take. All studies would be done in Latin, and it was expected that the students would be able to converse in Latin as well. So questions and responses in Latin. For all the careers that people went to university for, they all started off with the arts program. Often we refer to as the liberal arts. And we talked about this before, the quadrivium, the trivium, where you start off with a study of geometry, astronomy, arithmetic, and music, eventually moving to grammar, rhetoric, and logic. That process could take anywhere from 4 to 7 years. Usually most students did it in 6. And then after having completed that, after getting essentially your Master of Arts, then you would go on to study either canon or civil law, medicine, or theology. Those were kind of the additional opportunities after that. And there would be 4 separate faculties. One that would be the arts faculty, that would teach all those courses we mentioned earlier. Then there would be a faculty for the study of law, faculty for medicine, and a faculty for theology. Having done 7 years of study, by the 14th century you would engage in then 14 more years of study in theology, where you would start out as a hearer, eventually moving on to the biblical bachelor's degree, achieving a bachelor on the sentences. The sentences was a work by a scholastic theologian named Peter Lombard. And anyone working on a doctorate in theology was expected to produce a commentary on this work. Eventually, though, the works of Thomas Aquinas supplanted that and became the standard. From the bachelor on the sentences, you would move into your foreign bachelor's, your licensed master's, and then onward to the doctorate. Progressing through this field of theology. In the East, and this is predominantly in the West, in the East, there wasn't as much of an emphasis on theology as a formal discipline. So you don't see this development of a university system that taught theology. Which meant that by the later part of the Middle Ages, any sort of conversation between Greek and Latin theologians were often uneven. Because the Catholics had professionalism, they had learned skills in argumentation that the Greeks just hadn't learned. They were studying, classic Greek Christian Greek writings and other things. It wasn't that they were ignorant; they just didn't have these other skills that theology students had been expected to develop as they went through the university system. Most of the universities up to about the 1400s were connected with the church, or were started by the Catholic Church. But universities founded after 1450 tended to come from princes or other rulers rather than the church. And it seems by that point, a lot of the ruling people of different areas looked upon universities as a status symbol. Right? It indicated how well you were or how important your region was if you had a university. So you see more secular impulse to developing universities, even though the universities still themselves would have been religious in nature. I mentioned the study of canon law as an important development in the studies of university students throughout this time. Essentially, canon law refers to the laws governing the practice of Christianity, and not necessarily, kind of internal laws related to how churches operate, the religious officials. Now, ecclesiastical law is something different. Ecclesiastical law referred to how the relationships between church and state, and what rights the emperor has to the church. Canon law, however, were the laws enforced by the hierarchy of the church. Some of this was shaped by the Code of Justinian that we talked about several lectures ago, those that had some civil components but also some religious components. Now, certainly some of the canons, or rules, might be another word that you could think of, were about doctrine and morality, but they also included other rules. For example, the rules of religious orders, what it meant to be a Franciscan, what it meant to be part of the Cistercian order. Other laws developed throughout history as well. And those laws had developed in a variety of places. In the Council of Nicaea, for example, one of the laws that developed said that anyone that was excommunicated in one area is excommunicated everywhere. Right? So you couldn't just move and be in the good graces of the church. That would be an example of canon law. This was kind of working out of certain concepts and rules related to church life. The phrase canon law comes into use in the 12th century, although Catholics would point back as far as the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 as beginning principles of canon law. So, for example, in Acts 15, there's debate over what expectations the Gentiles, or should be held on the Gentiles related to the law of Moses. Should they be circumcised, for example? And at the end of Acts 15, James crafts a letter where it's kind of giving the decision of the apostles and the elders of Jerusalem regarding what things the Gentiles have to keep. Things like not eating things strangled, not eating blood, preventing not eating meats offered to idols, fornication. There's 3 or 4 different things there. And so they would point to that as an example of the earliest expression of canon law, even though the term wasn't used. Often a lot of the principles and rules that became canon law came from the different councils that were developed in those early times, those gatherings of bishops, the ecumenical councils. Additional rules were developed from the formal decisions by the bishops of Rome, giving heavy weight to what they had decided. The first systemizing of canon law appears to have come from the middle of the 1100s, and trying to pull it all together, bring it into a significant type of collection. Among the Gradian appears to have been the first to try and systematically bring them out. Additionally, he also developed, and this will become very important in the universities, a system on how to interpret canon law, what's known as jurisprudence. How you take these rules and apply them in a variety of situations, especially if a situation develops that is not specifically addressed by a rule. Important for this was, of course, the rules by the bishops, the councils, the Bishop of Rome. But then there was also the importance of natural law. The belief that there are certain rights, there are certain values that are universally accepted and universally understood through the reason, not necessarily through revelation. It's this idea of natural law that will become very important in English schools of jurisprudence and then even into the colonial American experience. The idea of natural law. There are some things perceived through nature and through the reason. And Aquinas was one of the first major proponents of natural law. It would be the canon law would especially be important for the Inquisition, as it guided the inquisitors as to how to perform interrogations, what constituted heresy, what the responses to heresy were. All of this would shape that court type of system. What questions do you have about either theology in the universities or canon law?
With the upgrading of the education that was being done, is this a period of time when the middle class is really expanding?
Yeah, you have this, they're kind of very similar time periods developing. That the middle class is developing, the universities are developing. Universities are a little bit earlier than the middle class.
At what period is this in terms of the arts?
We're just getting into, this would be slightly before the Renaissance. All right, and so we'll talk about the Renaissance on Thursday related to art and music, but they're coming around the same time. And the big difference here is that the universities start off as predominantly related to scholasticism, which we'll talk more about here in a minute. But as people became more interested in Aristotle through scholasticism, it birthed a general interest in classical learning in general, which leads to the Renaissance.